Good morning. Welcome to Vinyl Siding. We have a great show for you today. We're going to be digging deep into Appetite for Destruction, probably one of the most iconic albums. I know personally for me, it meant a lot to my world, really affected a way that I looked at rock and roll music after that. But before we touch base on that, I want to give a shout out to Rosenfeld Dental Associates, located at 1095 Inman Avenue in Edison, New Jersey. Go rock your smile with the Rock Doc. David Rosenfeld, nominated one of the top Jersey dentists in 2021. If you tell them that you heard this on the Rock and Roll Union or CT sent you, they'll hook you up with a great discount, guys. And like I said, we were supposed to be, Bill, at Artie's today. Unfortunately, some personal issues for me kind of got in the way and weren't able to make it out there. But that show is still going on. If you guys are in the area, you want to check out some great tribute bands, they have a full lineup for you today, starting at 4 o'clock. They're going to be rocking throughout the night. Not sure if it's going to be an indoor or an outdoor show because of the weather. They're kind of playing that by ear right now, but get out there and check it out. So, Bill, another show, another iconic album. We're going to be digging into the debut for Guns N' Roses, the number one debut album of all time, as far as sales is concerned.
Absolutely. This is probably one that we could have done during the preview shows, which were all focused on some of the world's best-selling albums. You know, Appetite has sold, I think, about 28 million copies, if memory serves me right, with close to 20 million of those in the United States alone. I mean, it's phenomenal record as far as what it did with regard to sales. And what's interesting about it is it wasn't a hit right out of the gate. I think it took about a year or so for it to really catch fire.
Yeah. You know, just as a personal side note, I was 12 when this album came out. And I remember my mom had a friend. We went and visited my mom's friend, and her son's talking to me, and he's like, "Have you heard of Guns N' Roses?" And I was like, no, I was just getting into music. And I was like, no, who are they? And he proceeded to tell me about the Dirty Harry movie. They were kind of catching fire with that, with the Dirty Harry Deadpool movie. They were in it. They did the Welcome to the Jungle was like one of the main songs for the movie. And it seemed like they exploded after that release.
Absolutely. I don't know that they would necessarily admit it now, but I think their participation in the Deadpool definitely gave them a lot of exposure that they might not otherwise have had. I remember that I didn't hear the record on radio at all until probably around late 1988. By that point, it was already out for a year and a half.
Yeah. It was amazing to me, and it was just a sign of the times. MTV, once MTV picked up Guns N' Roses kind of just went wildfire with I remember Welcome to the Jungle debuting and everybody just kind of losing their mind. We were a lot of people unfairly lump Guns N' Roses into that hair band, but they were, to me, there's a connection between, like, they were the midpoint between the grunge movement that would come later and the 80s hair band that was before that. Guns N' Roses was more straight up rock and roll, hard rock and roll, blues influence definitely. And you could hear that. And I mean, if you go back and listen to, they had the reissue that came out a couple years back. Some of the covers that they were doing at the time, Jumpin' Jack Flash and things like that, where their influences were coming from.
Oh, absolutely. And it's interesting that you mentioned the glam image, because certainly prior to Appetite coming out, Guns N' Roses did come out with their 4-song EP, limited edition at the time, Live Like a Suicide. The photo of Axl Rose and Doug McKagan on that EP screams glam. It absolutely does. And they clearly, when you listen to the record, were not a glam band at all. They were definitely influenced by Aerosmith. I mean, they covered Mama Kin on that record. They were regularly playing a whole lot of Rosie back then. I mean, Axl obviously would later work with AC/DC, but back in those days, he was paying tribute to it. Um, Nice Boys, the Rose Tattoo song. Yeah, Rose Tattoo were label mates of AC/DC's in Australia. Um, I'm sure that's how Axl came upon that record as well, and that's also on that album, that EP is as well. So, there was a lot going on with this band that weren't going on with the other LA hair metal bands. I mean, in the early '80s, when Guns N' Roses first came together, Motley Crue and Rat pretty much ruled the roost on Sunset
Oh
Boulevard, if I
yeah,
remember right.
yep. And I mean, even when you look at their ballads, I mean, Guns N' Roses had "Sweet Child of Mine," which was their classified ballad. But if you go back and you look at some of the '80s hair band ballads, the power ballads, they were a lot fluffier, a lot.
Yeah.
Uh, the singer in a lot of those '80s songs is almost feminine like. There's just so much fluff to like power ballads that even Sweet Child didn't kind of go down that route.
It really did not. I mean, and that was in some regards one of the things that was beautiful about Guns N' Roses, where a lot of the glam bands, Motley Crue, we mentioned, of course, Poison would come a little bit later. Bands in that general vein went out of their way to get the look right and to try and play towards the commercial. They tried desperately to get themselves on the radio. With Guns N' Roses, it was more like, this is who we are. If you like it, great. If you don't, the hell with you.
Yeah, exactly. So, do you want to give us a little bit of a lead up into this album before we start going track by track?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Guns N' Roses are an interesting band in that they came from very different places, ultimately to all land in the early '80s LA Sunset Boulevard hair metal, glam metal scene, or whatever you want to call it. The key members of the band are of course Axl Rose, the lead singer, and for me at least, the quote unquote second guitar player, Izzy Stradlin. Axl and Izzy, Axl's real name is William Bailey. Izzy's real name is Jeff Isbell. They grew up together in Lafayette, Indiana, and had bands together, got stoned together, or whatever, back in the '70s, in their teens. They knew each other well. Izzy, I think, at a fairly early age, had aspirations for being a rock star. I'm not necessarily sure if Axl did, but Izzy made it clear that that this was the route he wanted to follow. Izzy finished high school in 1980. He was, in fact, I think, the only member of the original Guns N' Roses lineup to finish school. But he graduated high school and very shortly after left to LA to try and make a mark in the music business. Axl had a troubled childhood. A lot of that's well documented. I don't know that I'll go into a lot of the details about that here, but he was a classic juvenile delinquent. He had been arrested, I think, like 20 times before his 18th birthday, and it was clear that the cops in Lafayette were wanting to put him behind bars for a long time. Then we're really just looking for the excuse to do that. Axl became aware of that, and in 1982. Followed Izzy to LA and linked up with him in 1983. Axl and Izzy ultimately started their own band together in LA, a band called Hollywood Rose, which had a number of interesting people come through it. One particular person I'll mention who I think has a fairly large role to play in the early Guns N' Roses legacy, who's been largely, I think, forgotten, is a fellow by the name of Chris Webber. Chris Webber was a bit younger than Axl and Izzy when Hollywood Rose got together in 1983. Chris Webber was all of about 16 years old, but he was responsible for, with Izzy, writing the original songs on the Live Like a Suicide EP, as well as one of the songs, Anything Goes, that ultimately landed on Appetite. And they had a fairly good sized following, Hollywood Rose did, in 1983, 1984. But ultimately, as so many bands do between playing gigs, drugs, whatever, they ultimately fell apart. They ultimately ended up joining forces with various members of the original lineup of Tracy Gunn's band, LA Guns, hence the name Guns N' Roses. LA Guns, Hollywood Rose. Three members of LA Guns, Tracy, Ole Beach and Rob Gardner, Ole on bass and Rob on drums, joined forces with Axl and Izzy. Eventually, over the course of several months, that fell out, and Ole and Rob Gardner were replaced by Duff McKagan, who had been knocking around LA for about a year or so at that point. He originally hailed from Seattle. And Steven Adler, who was an LA kid. He was a friend of Slash's. Slash was a big time BMX racer, actually won awards at it back in the day. They played in various bands together. In particular, there was a band called Road Crew that Slash and Duff and Steven were part of. And what happened with Guns N' Roses was that Duff and Steven joined first. Eventually, Axl became aware of Slash and made the decision pretty much on his own that Slash would be in the band, whether Tracy stayed or not. And Tracy wasn't particularly keen to share the stage with two other guitarists, let alone one, actually. And so he decided on his own at that point to leave the band, and he restarted LA Guns at that point. And so at that point now, in early 1986, we got to the classic Guns N' Roses lineup of Axl, Izzy, Slash, Duff, and Steven. They were able to make a name for themselves pretty quickly. They made various demo tapes and were looking to find a label association fairly quickly. But again, they wanted to do this on their own terms. Ultimately, they were able to get a signing with Geffen Records, who was still a relatively new label at the time. Geffen Records had only started in 1980 and were at this point still something of a minor label that was being distributed at the time by Warner Brothers. They had not really gotten into the metal scene in any great way, and they viewed this as a way to do that. The first record they made for Geffen, although it was somewhat done clandestinely under Geffen's auspices, was the Live Like a Suicide record. Live Like a Suicide was packaged to look like an independent release. It wasn't. It was made by Geffen. It was recorded in the studio, despite the fact that it's named as a live album. It was recorded in the studio with dubbed applause. And as we mentioned, it has on it the two Hollywood Rose songs that Izzy and Chris Webber wrote, Move to the City and Reckless Life, along with Nice Boys, the Rose Tattoo song, and Mama Kin, the Aerosmith song. And the release of that one, at least initially, was limited pretty much to the LA area. I think they made 10,000 copies of it, sold out very quickly. And it became clear that Guns N' Roses were, at least in Geffen's mind, poised for success, at least on a regional basis. And so they went ahead to record Appetite at that point. This is in late 1986, early 1987. Interestingly, there was a fair amount of discussion and debate about how the record should be made. New bands typically would be assigned a staff producer with a record label back in those days. That was not what happened with GNR. They spoke with some fairly high-profile people about making this record. The Live Like a Suicide demo was made at Pasha Studios. Pasha was Spencer Proffer's label. And Proffer was one of the people that was initially approached. And in fact, I think quite a few of the demos that ultimately found their way onto Appetite were originally made at Pasha, with Proffer residing and helping to guide that. But he ultimately did not produce. Paul Stanley, I think, was considered at one point as producing, and for whatever reason the decision was made not to. Axl wanted Mutt Lange, who at the time was fresh from producing AC/DC and Def Leppard, to produce, and he was interested, but apparently wanted more money than Geffen was willing to spend. And so they ended up working ultimately with Mike Klink, who was a Geffen staff producer who had some level of success with some other artists. A critical decision that was made also was that while Mike Klink would produce and he would do the initial engineering that he would not be responsible for mixdown. Two of the hottest mixing engineers in LA back in the middle 80s when this record was made were Steve Thompson and Mike Barbiero. And they did the mixdown for the record. And they did a superb job on it. I mean, this record absolutely plays regardless of what type of equipment you have. The smallest Walkman back in the day, boombox, to a full-size stereo, this record really screams at you. They did a wonderful job of recording it. And of course, Mike Klink as well. So that's the overall backstory, I think, as far as how we got to the album as it was made, the 12 songs that were recorded.
Yeah, the other thing that is, I don't have my notes in front of me, but the initial album cover, which I absolutely love. I absolutely love that, to the point where my wife specially made a back patch for my war vest. I couldn't find one. I wanted the original Guns N' Roses cover on the back of my war vest and couldn't get one anywhere. My wife had to make one out of whatever kind of fabric, and she set it up. So I have the back of the original album, and the label just would not have it. I mean, the depiction of rape, the depiction of just a kind of like an overtake of industrialism almost. I mean, there is, even though the label was a little taken aback by what might have been, in their mind, a little rough, a little abrasive, there's actual truth and beauty in that original cover that I don't think ever really got the consideration it needed.
The cover is, in spite of the fact that it was only very briefly used on initial copies of the record before it was pulled, that artwork from Richard Williams is iconic. Williams, for people who are watching this who might not be familiar, was best known back in the 60s, prior to doing this art, as doing art for drag racers and funny cars. So he had something of a niche market going for himself. I don't know quite how he got linked up with the band, but this artwork, the quote unquote rapist robot artwork that we're talking about, is very emblematic of his work, and I think in some regards speaks very well to the content of the record, so much so that even during the Use Your Illusion tours in 1991 and 92, during playing of Welcome to the Jungle, there would be an inflatable version of the robot that would be deployed on stage.
That's awesome. And from what I heard, it was it was a postcard that Axl had found in a shop somewhere, and he fell in love with it to the point that he wanted that to be the cover of the album. And the artist was fine with it. It was just Geffen that wasn't. And getting a little bit into the tracking, I mean, right off the bat, Welcome to the Jungle just blisters out of the speakers. It hits you in the face. And like we talked earlier, with them including that in the Dirty Harry Deadpool movie at the time, for younger people, Dirty Harry was it was the big thing at the time. I mean, Clint Eastwood was very big in that Dirty Harry role, and the addition of this virtually unknown band in this movie, they actually played a band in the movie.
Yep.
It was iconic, and it went big for GNR.
It really did. What also was done around that song to help promote the record was a music video was made. And there was no small expense on that. Geffen enlisted the services of Nigel Dick, who was one of the big directors of MTV music videos back in the middle 80s, to do the video. And the video is interesting in terms of how it plays out. It shows Axl as being the naive guy who gets off of a bus in what looks like Los Angeles, and he's first encountered by a drug dealer played by Izzy, and ultimately goes through the metamorphosis of becoming one of these street characters himself by the time the video is over. MTV thought that Nigel Dick's video was more than a little bit abrasive too, that it was just too much out front with the drug culture, and really didn't want to show it at first. The deal I think that was made was that they would show it, but only between 4 and 6 in the morning.
Wow.
And they showed it a few times and ultimately got a fair amount of response from fans saying, "We want that one again." And so they got it into a more regular rotation based on the fans clamoring for it. The other thing that was interesting, and this was also fairly early on, I think right around the time the album was released in the spring of '87, Guns N' Roses had done a mini tour of the East Coast, and one of the shows they did at the Ritz in New York was recorded in full and was shown by MTV back then. So I think that helped them a fair amount too.
Oh yeah. Now the one thing that I do remember big time, because this was like going into my teenage years, man. Because even with like Use Your Illusion albums came out, I believe in 90.
September 17th of 1991. I remember the
Yeah.
date well.
So
for
yeah,
other
I was
reasons.
a sophomore in high school. So that led right through like me graduating high school. That album carried for a long time. And I just remember the videos, the live videos that MTV. I mean, I remember there being there was a pay-per-view at one point. There were other live videos, and it was the live videos of GNR that seemed to be everywhere.
Oh
Like
yeah.
they made a big deal out of these live videos, and I think that was a big thing that gave the band a lot of legitimacy early on. And then add to that the fact of the riots and Axl being Axl and all the stuff that went behind that, man. Like
Axl being Axl is a delicate way of putting it.
I can't stress to you enough like how big, like at that time you heard it everywhere. That's what all you heard about was the riots and people fighting and Axl jumping off stage attacking photographers, and like those live videos did a lot for the band, and they might have ultimately been the downfall of why everybody kind of fell apart, was a lot of the stuff that went on the road. But they go from Welcome to the Jungle to It's So Easy, and It's So Easy even to today was always their opener when you saw them live. It's So Easy was always their opener, and the vocals on It's So Easy is a little bit of a lower pitch for Axl than what you're kind of used to.
It really is, and I'm not sure if this is the reason why, but Axl generally was the primary lyricist of a lot of GNR's music. He was not for It's So Easy. It's So Easy is Duff's song.
Yeah.
For the most part. With lyrics by his friend, the late Westar Keane, who was a friend of the band. And it's one that, as you said, goes back to the relatively early days of the band and endured for a fairly long time as an opener for them as a result. It's a song that, is, at least as far as its content is concerned, is even more so than Welcome to the Jungle, showing the band's take no prisoners attitude.
Yeah.
This is what we think. If you don't like it, tough.
I mean, a lot of the feel of this song, I think, would be echoed later with Double Talk and Jive. It kind of reminds me of almost an early version of. There was a lot in that song, the low, like we were saying, the low pitch kind of rapping almost in the beginning of this. Just the way that Axl handles that lyric. And then right into Night Train. And the thing that I remember most about Night Train was Axl's speech on stage when the band was starting to really hit some rough spots. And him saying, you know, if the band doesn't stop playing with with Night Train and Mr. Brownstone, then there was going to be issues. It might be the last show, yada, yada, yada. But yeah, there was a lot of drug influence in that as well.
Well, Night Train, of course, is the name of a very potent brand of wine, Night Train Express, that apparently the band was fond of. And as the story goes, Axl and Slash and Izzy were walking down Sunset Boulevard, passing the bottle back and forth, and it literally came to them as they were drinking Night Train very late one night. The lyrics just started coming out of all of them. So,
Yeah.
some of the songs of this album apparently got written very much in the moment.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, Out to Get Me being another one, and that was kind of in. I've heard covers of this. Out to Get Me. Hailstorm has done a cover of this.
Yep.
Lizzie doing very good on this song, but that was kind of another prisoner, take no prisoners type of thing, and nobody's bringing them down. Nobody's trapping them. Like, you can really see the street culture in that.
Yeah, I've never seen this verified anywhere, but I always looked at Out to Get Me as being Axl's FU to the folks in and the police in Lafayette.
Gotcha.
Where it was just, you think you're going to bring me down? Well, guess what, guys? I'm in charge here. I'm going to do what I see fit.
Yeah, I mean, that was always the way for Axl. I mean, what's really crazy to me is the songs that came out of this session that would go on to Use Your Illusion, and we'll talk about that when we get through this. But there were so many songs that, like, when they released the Appetite for Destruction, the re-release, I was like, wow, I was totally surprised, and I'm like very, very big into GNR. I didn't know that some of these songs went that far back.
Oh, yeah. I mean, a good portion of Use Your Illusion, I would say at least 12 songs of the 30 that were on those two albums, at least a dozen of them go back to the Appetite days. I mean, this band was very fertile and very prolific at this time.
I mean,
all the drugs and whatever else that was going on.
The band, the one song that I think whoever produced the album, whoever released the album, dropped the ball on entirely. But it was fun hearing it come out with Shadow of Your Love. Shadow of Your Love, I really feel should have been released with this album because it sounds of that era. You can tell it's from that era. And there's so much on here that lends itself to that.
Yeah, I wonder about exactly why they didn't, because in 1987 was the beginning of the CD era. They certainly could have fit the song on a CD. If I had to make a guess, I think what might have stopped them from including as much material was that in 87, CDs hadn't completely taken over yet as the main distribution mechanism. People were still buying LPs, people were still buying cassettes. And as an LP, Appetite was like 26 and a half, 27 minutes per side. So they really couldn't fit much more.
Yeah. And then, I mean, you go from that to Mr. Brownstone. Now, Mr. Brownstone is probably one of my favorites off this album. I love the shuffle sound to it. Just the lyrics, the whole of this song, and nobody really picking up on it when it was released about the meaning of heroin and how far heroin was going to go. Mr. Brownstone was really I feel a little bit ahead of its time.
It was. And I mean, for me at least, it tells you how clueless some of the how the radio programmers operated, how clueless they were back then. Because if you'd listen, even with a half an ear to the lyrics, I used to do a little, but a little didn't do it, so a little got more and more. It's absolutely about heroin, for God's sake.
Right. And then you go from that to the big single, Paradise City. And Paradise City was, I don't know if it was bigger than Welcome to the Jungle, but it was a huge hit for them.
It was a huge hit. You're right. What was interesting about it was, I think, the last single that was released from the album, for a couple of reasons. Number one was the band wasn't that crazy about the song themselves, but the other is it's a long song, the longest in the album, nearly 7 minutes.
Yeah.
But it was released, if memory serves, in late 1988. I think it came out just before GNR Lies did. And it was very heavily promoted by MTV through a video where they took a fair amount of footage from a show that Guns N' Roses had done at Giant Stadium in East Rutherford.
Yep.
The story on this, and I can't verify it. I haven't seen the video in a long time. I probably should have watched it before we got on air. But as you know, I play in a band in Legion of Prague. Legion of Prague's guitar player is a gentleman who's a huge metal fan from the 80s, Mike Cernelia. Mike and I watched the video together once, a couple of years back, and there's a scene near the end of the video as they're reaching the climax of the song where Slash has to duck. He's running across the stage. He has to duck because someone has thrown a towel at him. Mike claims that he is the man that threw the towel.
Oh, wow. If so, that's really cool, man. That's a good, that's awesome.
I'd love to find a way on how to validate that. I haven't figured out that part of it yet, though.
And I mean, the other side of Paradise City with the video was, if you look at the Black Crowes Hard to Handle video, it was taken at the same show. It was shot in black and white, same as Paradise City.
Mm-hmm.
And you could tell that it was the same stage.
Yep.
So it was the two bands that rode off that whole summer together. And there's just something that must be said, coming from a straight guy, about that white suit that Axl wore in that video, man. I just always loved that white suit that Axl had on. The white pants, the white leather jacket, badass stage presence for them guys. But the other question that I had was, you see a lot of the live video, and you see that it took part in a good part of the daytime.
Yes.
It wasn't even a nighttime show. It was something that happened during the daytime. And for them at that point to be bringing the Black Crowes around, who would be iconic in themselves, makes
me a good year before Shake Your Moneymaker came out too.
Yeah, true that. And I just, for it happening so close to here, I wish I'd have been at that show. And then that's the end of side one. Side two picks up with my all-time favorite Guns N' Roses song, My Michelle, which to me has one of the most kick-in-your-face opening lines ever. Your daddy works in porno now that mommy's not around. To me, that line was like, they're just kicking the door in there. It's just so in your face right from the beginning of the song.
It is an amazing song, and it is one apparently that is grounded in a lot of fact. Slash had a friend back in those days named Michelle Young, whose daddy did work as a photographer for Stag magazines and for porno movies. And her mother did kill herself with heroin.
Yeah.
And so yeah, she's immortalized in these lyrics forever. Apparently, they were somewhat conscious about the thought of lawsuits. Someone was, if it wasn't the band, but it was probably someone at Geffen. But they consulted her on it. She signed off on it. She thought that this was wonderful.
Wow.
That this was being done this way. And later, when she made the decision to straighten out her own life, she sort of used this as a signpost to do so. That it was really putting out there for the rest of the world how messed up her life had become.
Yeah. And then, I mean, the next two songs, Think About You is not a ballad, but the lyrics kind of lend themselves that way. It's a little bit sweeter for a GNR tune, content-wise. And I think it was a great lead-in to Sweet Child of Mine.
Yeah, it sure was. Think About You is, for me, the classic Izzy Stradlin song. I mean, this is what Izzy doing what Izzy does best.
Yeah.
Coming up with great melody, great rhythm guitar background. I mean, Izzy, for me, was the unsung hero of the early era of Guns N' Roses. More than anybody else, he was the glue that held the band together. He was a great rhythm guitar player. He was a bridge to the rhythm section. He gave Slash a lot of room to take leads, but was, of course, capable of doing lead guitar in his own right. And perhaps most importantly, because of the fact that he had grown up with Axl, he, quite frankly, knew where to draw the line where, to be perfectly blunt, where Axl's bullshit was concerned.
Yeah. That being so close to the point that I think that's why Izzy stopped coming around. There was a lot of talk about Izzy not being happy with the money that was being handled a certain way, how not everybody was having the same cut of the money the band was generating. And a lot of that did end up sorry about that. My sinuses are killing me today. But to the point that I think that that Izzy, I agree with you 100%. He's the Keith Richards of GNR in the early days. And I understand his problem with the money. I understand. I mean, he had so many different song credits, lyric credits throughout GNR, the beginning of GNR. And I think he just got tired of dealing with a lot of the bullshit that the band was giving out, mainly from Axl. But that being said, the thing about you leading into Sweet Child of Mine, I think there were songs that were put together this way throughout this album that almost were paired for a reason. And Sweet Child of Mine, as most people know, started off as a like an intro, like a warming up type thing for Slash that kind of developed into much more.
Yep. No, you said it perfectly. I mean, it was Slash's warm-up finger exercise. And there would happen to be one day that Duff McKagan was in the room with Slash and heard it and came up with a bass line to go with it. And it took off from there, pretty much in the studio. The piece I always thought was interesting was the extended construction of the song. The song itself, with the vocals really is over in the space of about 3 minutes.
Right.
At which point then it kicks into a higher gear for Izzy's and Slash's guitar solos, which was something that I don't know if it was 100% spontaneous, but it probably at least started that way. And Mike Klink, the producer, loved the way it sounded and just told them, keep going. And eventually they got to a breakdown and he cues Axl. And Axl's got nothing to sing. He doesn't have any lyrics for it. So Axl's singing, "Where do we go now?" was truly him saying, "Where do we go now? What do you want me to do with this?"
And that's great on Axl's part. That is absolutely great. And then, I mean, the next song on the album, I've always preferred the acoustic version of You're Crazy. I love the acoustic version. Absolutely love the acoustic version. I think there was something that was lost on the electric version that didn't like transfer over. I don't know what came first. I don't know if the acoustic
version came first.
And there was just something that felt so sped up and so almost like the abridged version of the acoustic version. Like there was just something about the acoustic version of Anything Goes that absolutely I fell in love with.
Well, again, you're talking about You're Crazy. Anything Goes comes next. But you're absolutely
You're
right.
You're crazy. Yeah, I skipped over You're Crazy.
Yeah. No, You're Crazy was written originally as an acoustic tune. And in fact, I think even in the liner notes to GNR Lies, where the acoustic version was ultimately recorded and released, I think they even state that there.
Yeah.
As a producer, I can understand why Mike Klink would have wanted them to redo it as electric for flow reasons, to be able to make the record flow better from song to song. But there's no question that the song works better as an acoustic tune. And talking about songs and how they're paired together, pairing the acoustic version of You're Crazy with Used to Love Her on GNR Live was epic. It was absolutely beautiful.
And I mean, talking about songs that were partnered together, the last two on this album, Anything Goes and Rocket Queen. There's times where I can't listen to Rocket Queen without hearing Anything Goes beforehand, just because I think it flows so good together, like from one into the next. It's like the last chunk of this album just really does it.
Yeah, Anything Goes, as we mentioned earlier, is one of the older songs on the album. It's a Hollywood Rose tune with a good contribution from Chris Webber to the lyrics and to the music. It's a song that perhaps obviously didn't get a lot of radio airplay. It's a song about anal sex. But it's again, one that just jumps out at you, and it's a perfect lead-in to the sleazy feel of Rocket Queen,
Yeah.
which is sleazy for a whole bunch of reasons.
I'll tell you what, the story going into Rocket Queen, the story that always blew my mind, and I never understood how he let it happen, was the girlfriend of Steven Adler went into the studio with Axl, which is where the sex noises in the song come from. And like, I go, how does this happen? It always bewildered me.
I can only guess what was going on in the heads of the guys in the band and the producer and the women, and I will start. And let me just rephrase. There's one woman whose voice and moans are on the track, and that's Steven Adler's girlfriend, Adriana Smith. You're right. She apparently wasn't the only woman taken into the studio for this purpose.
Jeez.
There's according to Thompson and Barbiero, the mixing engineers, there were at least 3 women who were recorded having sex with Axl for the song.
Wow. Now, I mean, I can't imagine this happening in today's day and age. I mean, that's you got to think that the women agreed to it, but you can't picture this kind of thing happening in today's society.
Well, no, you can't. I mean, cancel culture would be all over this like
right.
Flies on shit, quite frankly. Now, to talk about the song itself, the lyrics of Rocket Queen apparently were influenced by another woman who was a groupie who ultimately became something of a brothel madam on Sunset Strip. Her name was Barbie. And I know there have been interviews with Adriana Smith after the fact saying, I'm on the record, but I'm not the one the song's about. She makes it clear. Now, this is an interesting song, again, from a construction point of view, because like Sweet Child of Mine, it's a fairly long song. I mean, Sweet Child is just under 6 minutes. Rocket Queen is just 6 minutes over, or just over 6 minutes, 6 minutes 15, I think. But again, at the 3-minute mark or so, the flavor of the song changes. You go from the vocal section into something that some very ballad-like. We're switching over from a hard rock tune that's really just in your face with all these bumping and grinding sex noises, and all of a sudden now it's a very, very tender ballad where Axl is singing about how much he cares for this woman. And maybe it was done intentionally to marry these 2 songs together to take some of the edge away from how nasty the first part of the song was. But it comes out as being a minor masterpiece. I mean, it's really brilliant the way it's put together. And you can argue about the content and whether the content is politically correct. Clearly it's not. But they did a really good job at taking something that could have been very off-putting and making it one of the strongest records on the album. They really did a terrific job with it.
I mean, I agree with you as far as the ballad part is concerned. It once you first listen to it, it kind of confuses you a little bit because of the beginning of the song. And there's a lot going on in this one song. In 6 minutes, there's so much going on. Like you were saying, between the sex noises, the ballad, the just the way the music is composed on here is there's so much going on, but they put it together seamlessly.
Absolutely. I mean, in the vinyl era, it was so important to get a flow for the album, to do what they referred to as album design, which was basically figuring out the sequencing of what songs should come after which in order to make the maximum possible effect for the listener who would put it on their turntable. And whoever was responsible for sequencing the songs on this record was a master. Absolutely beautiful job of it.
And I'm looking over some of the songs that were left off of Appetite that would come on later, like some of the songs we were talking about. You said probably at least a dozen we're talking big songs for them too, like November Rain.
Oh yeah.
November Rain was part of the recording, but they decided because they had the Ballad and the Sweet Child that they left November Rain off. And I mean, I honestly think it was a good point, and I think that November Rain was a great later hit for them, so that it showed that they were capable of doing things outside of Appetite, even though it was included in the Appetite recordings.
No, that was, as we said, this was a very, very fertile time for this band. I mean, they were kicking on all cylinders, not only as far as playing the music, but on coming up with new material. And ultimately, the 4 new songs that they had, or really 3 new songs, I should say, on GNR Lies, because You're Crazy had already been released. But when you listen to those 3 songs, Used to Love Her, Patience, and 1 in a Million, and then you couple that with what was released all at one time, 30 songs on 2 CDs for the Use Your Illusion albums, it's just remarkable, the depth of what this band was capable of.
I mean, you brought up a song that no GNR, I mean, a lot of people will pretend that it never existed. They dropped it off of the re-release, is that 1 in a Million, and the hoopla and the drama that circled that song, to the point that I always had a hard time understanding how Slash would agree to do that song, being that Slash is half black himself, is just the lines that are in that song. And I'm actually really surprised in the cancel culture that we have, that as GNR goes back out on the road again, they basically haven't stopped since 2016 when Slash and Duff came back, that no one said a word about this song.
Well, I can only guess as to what's going on with that. I mean, Axl has made some obviously questionable decisions over the course of GNR's career in terms of what he might include on records and why. I mean, the inclusion of Look at Your Game Girl on the Spaghetti Incident is another example of that. I mean, I can't really imagine why anyone would want to put money into Charles Manson's or now his estate's pocket, but obviously he did.
But that was something that Axl always did, though. He always wore the Charles Manson T-shirts. He always had that air of Charles Manson, and I think he did that for just kind of showmanship, just kind of putting that strange air about Axl. And ever since the band came back, like I said, sorry, my sinuses, 2016, when GNR got back together, I mean, you're still missing Steven Adler. You're still missing Izzy Stradlin. But you have Slash and Duff back in the band. Axl has shown nothing but professionalism. I mean, gone are all the days that we were talking about of making crowds wait for hours on end before they started, or jumping off stage and attacking people. There's just been an air of professionalism about the band that is completely new.
Well, it's taken a while, but people do grow up. I mean, Axl's almost 60 years old now.
You're right. And it's funny because so many people gave Axl shit for the AC/DC stuff. And I think he did a great job. From the videos, I wasn't able to get to the show because the tickets were selling for insane amounts when Axl was opening, and I just wasn't paying it. But from the videos I've seen, Axl did a great job doing that as well.
Oh, he did. I was not particularly happy with the fact that happened, mostly because I thought Brian Johnson was and is a great singer for that material.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, I understand what was going on in AC/DC that allowed it to happen, and I mean, it is what it is in retrospect. But it didn't, as far as the musicianship, to the point you're making. You might question why it was done for professional reasons, but it was not unprofessional what they produced.
Right.
the quality of the product was terrific.
And it was, when you look back on it, it was the contractual obligations. It's not like Axl went on to be the new singer of AC/DC. AC/DC put out the next album with Brian Johnson. There's been talk about AC/DC maybe going back on the road one last time. I hope it happens. But to see what AC/DC even did with the passing of Malcolm and putting the nephew Young in there, I think there's always been that thing within AC/DC to kind of live up to their obligations, and I think they're doing a great job doing that.
Absolutely.
I think that was the big point of Axl being in there, is they didn't want to cancel on the fans, so they had to do the next best thing. But glad to hear that Brian Johnson's doing much better. Whatever, I know there was a procedure he went through, and what blew my mind with Brian Johnson was it wasn't the music that cost him his hearing. It was the hot rods that he was involved in that cost him his hearing. And to me, that was pretty good, because, he's been around music for 50 years, and now race cars are his downfall.
There are some things you can't figure out.
But as far as Guns N' Roses is concerned, I mean, this album was start to finish, as far as I'm concerned, one of the most perfect albums ever produced. I think from front to back, there's not a bad song on the album. It's almost an album for me that I have to listen to the whole thing. Listening to pieces is almost like a tease.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I mean, when my first purchase of the album in the late 80s was on a cassette, and it was probably about maybe 2.5 years after the album came out. So it wasn't a new record, but it was one that I was somewhat familiar with. And hearing it in sequence in the car, I mean, that was an experience that really made me respect what the band was capable of. And to your point, I was happy that I had it in that medium where I could just turn it on and let it flow from beginning to end, because that's how it should be heard. I mean, I made the point earlier that whoever sequenced this album did a masterful job on it. They really did. It's impossible not to conceive of these songs being put together in this way. I mean, for all the other things that were recorded at the time of these sessions, they made the right choices, I think, here for the most part.
And this is one of those albums that even like 30 plus years after its release, you'll never find this on like a $5 bin somewhere. You're not going to find a discount copy of this album, to the point that even still buying the album to this day, if you buy it on vinyl, it's going to cost you about $30, which is the same price as anything brand new coming out. This is an album that still holds the popularity and still holds its value all these years later. And to me, that's an amazing testament to a debut album.
It sure is. One thing that always struck me as interesting with the vinyl copies of this, and for that matter of GNR Lies, which came out the following year in '88, was they didn't have side 1 and side 2.
They had side GNR, yeah. Yeah, I always love that. And I wanted to buy the re-release when it came out in 2018. But the one issue that I had was it had all these extra songs, which I was fine with. But the side 2 of the second album was had nothing on it. It was like a hologram. So I didn't want to put out the money to just have a hologram for the second side. So I would rather much buy a copy of the original release than the re-release. I mean, I could always listen to the other songs everywhere. I mean, one of the things that they did with the super deluxe copy of that was they put basically all of Lies is on that.
Okay.
So looking on that, I'm actually looking off of Spotify to see that everything that's on here. So you have the original album, and then you got the live version of Knocking on Heaven's Door, which was, I think, everybody's first taste of that song. I remember it was on MTV, And then it was also the radio was playing the live version of Knocking on Heaven's Door before it was released on Use Your Illusion later. They got a whole lot of Rosie on here. Different outtakes, different demos, different versions of the songs, which I like listening to. That's where Shadow of Your Love was first put on. And then, yeah, they got the whole live Lies album on that.
You know, it's interesting that you mention Knocking on Heaven's Door. And we're obviously we're bouncing back and forth between the albums here. That one was released on Use Your Illusion 1, as you said. But what's interesting about Knocking on Heaven's Door for me is how the Guns N' Roses version has become the iconic one now. It's the one that you hear on the radio to the exclusion of the others. It wasn't even the first cover of it. I mean, Bob Dylan did the original, of course. Eric Clapton did a cover of it some years later.
Oh, yeah.
You'd never hear those anymore.
No. And it's funny because Guns N' Roses, I've always had this issue with music from this time period where certain bands are picked to continue classic rock. Like if you listen to commercial classic rock radio stations, you'll hear some Guns N' Roses on there. You'll hear some Bon Jovi on there. But then there's other bands like Cinderella or Rat or other bands in that vein that you don't really hear on those. Like they've been considered, they're not going to listen to that. That's not part of classic rock. But somehow GNR, Bon Jovi, some Poison, other things are considered part of that classic rock format now.
It's true. And it bothers me in the sense that there is so much good music that our kids are never going to hear, or their kids are never going to hear. Let's put it like that. I mean, Cinderella, you mentioned. I mean, Tom Kiefer was a terrific musician. I would dare say that I enjoyed Cinderella's music more so than Bon Jovi's. And I recognize John Bon Jovi was responsible for getting them a record contract, but I've never had any real affinity for Bon Jovi's music at all. Whereas Cinderella's music I do enjoy. But you have other bands, as you said, from that era. You know, LA Guns is a prime example. They made some great records that you don't hear anymore. Bands like Accept, Faster Pussycat, all from that period. And it's not like we're talking about songs that didn't have an impact in their time. We're talking about bands that had platinum albums, and they're all but forgotten by radio programmers now. I mean, I recognize that there's a lot that people try to fit into the classic rock format, but I almost wish that it would be carved up a little more finely. I mean, one of the reasons that I really don't listen to too much rock radio anymore, and when I do listen over the air, it's more to Sirius XM and satellite broadcasts, is because at least those folks, I think, recognize that there's more to life than just, you know, those 100 songs that the programmers have picked.
Yeah. And I think another big issue behind that is as satellite came out, as internet streaming services became available, that a lot of commercial radio is starting to lose as much income as they were bringing in, to the point that I don't think they even refresh their catalog anymore. I don't think if you turn on any station commercially, you're going to hear basically the same lineup day in and day out, day in, day out. And it's the same 10 songs in the same time format. And to the point that I don't think, like I said, I don't think they refresh their catalog at all.
And it really becomes just aggravating. I mean, even some of the bands that were just monumental in the classic rock era, Led Zeppelin comes to mind. I can't tell you the last time I heard a Led Zeppelin song on the radio that was not Whole Lotta Love,
right?
Kashmir, Black Dog, or Stairway. Those are the only ones. Maybe rock and roll occasionally.
I mean, the same thing with the Stones. And if there's ever a classic rock band, it's the Stones. And they play basically the same 5 songs from the Stones. It's like you're never going to hear like Heartbreaker play on the radio. You're not going to hear stuff like that. You're not going to, very rarely will you hear like Wild Horses or Sympathy for the Devil seems to be one of the songs that they play relentlessly. They'll play that one. They'll play Satisfaction, Jumpin' Jack Flash, and that might be it.
Well, and to tell you just how wrong that is, I think it's God. You'll need to refresh my memory because you might remember this better than me. But I think it was about 15 or so years ago, the Stones made a joint recording with Dave Matthews of the
Yeah.
Stones' old song "Memory Motel." One of the best songs they ever did. And radio does not play the Stones version at all.
No.
If you hear it now, it's that Dave Matthews version. And all due respect to Dave Matthews, he sold a few more records than I ever will. But I don't like that version of the song.
Right, right. Right. I mean, it's like I don't understand the choices behind that, but that's a big reason why we do what we do on this show, is that we try and keep it going, keep some of that love going. And there's new stuff. I'm really excited to kind of dig in this coming week to the new album. You and I had talked about it during the week, getting into Ghost's new album, which is fantastic. It is absolutely
great record,
phenomenal. And it comes something about Ghost that I'm noticing. I've seen them go from festival. I've watched them at festival. That's how I discovered the band for myself, was at a festival, and then I seen them opening spots, and then I seen them in a headline spot. Everything this band does seems to get better and better as they go. I mean, a lot of times you'll get that first, second album, and then that'll kind of plateau. But Ghost just seems to get better and better and better at what they do. So really excited for that one next week, guys. Do me a favor. Make sure if you're watching this on YouTube, give us a like, subscribe to the channel. And Bill, any closing thoughts on Appetite?
I think we've covered most of the ground on Appetite. I mean, it's a classic album that deserves to be a classic album, and I would dare say that in another 20 years or so time, our kids will still be talking about it. It's that good. I mean, it definitely has influences from that period. Had there not been an AC/DC or an Aerosmith beforehand, I think Appetite would have sounded very different.
Oh yeah.
But what Guns N' Roses did with Appetite was take those influences and add a lot of their own direction to it, and they came out with something very unique and very memorable. And it's going to be memorable for a long time. It's a classic in every sense of the word.
I will say that Guitar Gods, as far as some of the greatest guitar players that ever existed, I kind of put Slash up there. I think Slash is a phenomenal guitar player. I think he shows a lot of versatility, and he's played in so many different things. And with this being the start for him, it's really great. You can see, like you said, as far as Aerosmith is concerned, you notice a lot of Joe Perry in Slash. Had there not been Joe Perry, there wouldn't be Slash. But I think Slash has taken it above and beyond that, and is one of the newest. And we're saying, no, this album's been out for 30 plus years at this point. But he's one of the newest guitar icons out there, because before that, I mean, you had Eric Clapton, you had Jimmy Page, you had all those guitar gods. From the 80s, not so much. Not so many of the icons, Slash being one of them. And with them still being out on the road this summer, you can still go check them out, and it is well worth it. Even though no Steven, no Izzy, I've seen the new version, and they're phenomenal. And just remember that the drummer that they have now has now been with the band longer than Steven ever was. So,
well, Steven had some problems along the way that I think are pretty well documented. I don't know if we really need to go into them.
No.
But definitely, I mean, there's been a lot of people coming through Guns N' Roses over the years, but one thing that I will always say, I mean, I can sometimes question the motivation as to why Axl made replacements of various members of the band, but generally when he made replacements, it was to make the band better.
Yeah.
And some of the folks that he's played with over the years have definitely helped to galvanize the band's sound. I wasn't very optimistic up until 2016 that any vestige of the classic lineup would have gotten back together again. I think it's terrific that Axl and Slash and Duff have been able to make it work over the last 5.5 years, because I wouldn't have expected it.
The last thing that I'm going to say on the GNR and Appetite tidbit is I am dying for new material. I am dying for not rehash of the Chinese Democracy era. I am looking forward to the band where they are now putting out new music. I'm really excited to see where that goes.
I would love to see it. I'm a cynic. I probably am not going to hold my breath, but I would absolutely love to see it.
Yeah, I mean, it's something, like we said, they've been back together since 2016. So we're talking 6 years now. So it's time to put some new music out there.
Yeah, not. As I said, yeah, I'm cynical about this. I would tend to think that if Slash is writing anything new, that he's probably going to do that with Miles rather than with Axl. But I could be wrong.
Yeah, well, then again, think about how long it took Chinese Democracy to come.
Oh my God.
So, guys, thank you so much for joining us. We will be back here next week. We're going to be talking Ghost's new album, Imperium. Am I saying that correctly? Yes. Imperium, the new Ghost album, who I've seen them on tour on this album and are doing a phenomenal job. But until next time, guys, just keep rock and roll alive. Make sure you like, subscribe, and Bill, have a great rest of your week, my friend.
Oh, CT, you as well. It's a pleasure as always.
Talk to you soon.
Take care.